So for the probably like the last 15 years or so, before I ever go see a movie, I do two things. First, I avoid spoilers at all costs. If I'm seeing a movie on opening weekend, I might even go so far as to completely avoid the internet for like 24 to 48 hours. Like I legit delete social media apps. Before I get to the theater, the last thing I want to find out is that a main character dies at the end. When Avengers Endgame came out, if you haven't seen Avengers Endgame, I'm sorry, it's been 1,617 days and you should have seen it already. So don't be mad at me. But all the people who posted, dang, I can't believe they did Iron Man like that. I was like, wow, thanks for just totally spoiling the ending of the movie. Big spoilers really stink. Like Darth Vader is really Luke's dad. Luke's father. I'm sorry if you've never seen that. That's also super old. I don't even know how long. And the second thing I do besides avoid spoilers is I always check the critic score and the audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. I don't want to know how the movie ends, but I do want to know whether or not I'm seeing a good movie or a bad movie. And the reason it's so important is if you check the audience score and the critic score, and if they're different, that means it's probably going to be super solid. So, because for me at least, nothing is worse. I like to know what other people thought of the movie, but nothing's worse than thinking this movie is going to be awesome, only for it to be like the worst movie ever. Yes, I'm talking about Ant-Man, Quantumania. That was terrible. What was up with MODOK's face in that? Ugh. They did. It was terrible. Spider-Man 3, the one with Tobey Maguire, bad. Morbius, bad. Frozen 2, bad. And sometimes... Frozen 3. There's not.
Oh, Toy Story 4.
Toy Story 4 was also bad. Yes. And sometimes when I check Rotten Tomatoes, I find something super weird. The critic score will be really low, but the audience score will be really high. For example, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania had a critic score of 48%, but the audience score was 83%. And when the scores are that different, I honestly get kind of excited because I know I'm either going to love it or I'm going to hate it. Or I'm just going to think it was okay. And there's very little chance of that when it's so bad, okay? What are my options? That's a good point. But this got me thinking, people can feel strongly about almost anything in the world. Each of us in this room has thousands of opinions that we feel strongly about, and there's a good chance that none of us feels precisely the same way about everything. And honestly, I think that's it's honestly part of what makes our ministry so awesome. It's what makes Heartland Student Ministry so awesome, is that we can all come, and although we don't have all the exact same opinions on every single thing, we welcome each other. We don't have to agree on everything to get along. We're just here because we're trying to figure out how to be more like Jesus. But that begs the question, are there things that Jesus hates? I think there definitely are, but I think that list is probably a lot shorter than we think it is. So over the next few weeks, we're going to look at a few things that some Christians might say that Jesus hates, but I think they all deserve a second look. And so this series that we're starting tonight is 4 weeks long, and I couldn't come up with a better name than, I don't hate it. Because I hear so many of you guys say that. I'm like, how is this? I don't hate it. What? I don't know, I didn't hate it. I'm like, okay, cool. Well, we're like something that Jesus didn't hate, hopefully. And so tonight we're going to talk about culture. Culture is not as easy to define as you think, but it's the thing that brought us Mr. Beast and the Kardashians. I saw somebody here today wearing a Mr. Beast shirt, and I was like, sick. But they're in middle school, so they won't even hear that. It's every 5-hour YouTube rabbit hole, that's culture you've ever gone down. It's every shoe that celebrities wear when they're sitting on the floor seats at a Laker game. It's every Super Bowl halftime show. It's the commercials. It's every product placement. It's fast food. It's blue bubbles versus green bubbles. It's the movies we watch and the music we listen to. It's the blue and black dress versus the white and gold dress. You remember that? You guys were probably just babies when that was a thing. It's bigger than that, though. Culture is bigger than that. It's not just what we wear or what we do. In a weird way, it's also who we are. And when I was growing up, I was taught to avoid culture, especially popular culture at all costs. Why? Because I was told it was evil. And I wish I was kidding about this. My grandparents used to pray for my brother and my sister and me because we had committed an unthinkable sin. What had we done? We went to a movie. And now you might be asking yourself, what horrible, awful movie did they go see? We went to go see The Lion King. The original cartoon version. I was 7. But my grandparents grew up in a church that honestly thought and taught that movies as a whole were evil because they were part of the culture. And as Christians, we should go out of our way to avoid such things, right? Now, my goal here is not to make fun of my grandparents, and it's also not to say that every movie is God-honoring, because they absolutely aren't. But even as a 7-year-old, I found myself like, seriously? The Lion King? The Lion King? There's no way that Jesus would care whether or not I watched The Lion King, right? Now rewind even further to when my mom was in high school and she went to this youth group at this church that believes culture is very bad. Okay, she went to this church that also taught listening to secular music was evil. That was a big deal back then. Secular music basically means anything that isn't specifically Christian. And so one night at youth group, their leaders told them to bring all their secular CDs, and yes, they listened to CDs. It's on a disc. It's not video games on your phone. No, I'm just kidding. No, they listened to a music CD, okay? And they could bring their CDs to youth groups so they could throw them in a bonfire. And yeah, no, I'm serious. Good news, my mom skipped that night, but she told me about it. Because she had spent a surprising amount of money on those CDs, and it was the 80s, which is arguably the best and worst decade of music history, right? And so she just couldn't make sense of the idea that Jesus hated 80s music so much that he wanted her to throw it all on a bonfire. And that brings us to a question that we probably should wrestle with. If culture is made up of stuff like Disney animated classics and 80s music, does Jesus hate culture? Here's a spoiler alert. Jesus never said, I hate culture or I love culture. But he did talk about culture in a lot of indirect ways. And he talked about a lot of things in really indirect ways. Instead of saying, I think this or I think that, Jesus would often challenge the people he was talking to by telling them a story, and then he would leave them to try and figure out what he meant by the story. We call those stories, we call them parables. And so let's check out what Matthew tells us about the stories that Jesus would tell in Matthew 13:34. It says, all these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable. Yes, Jesus loved telling stories, and I think I have one tonight that might help answer our question of how Jesus feels about the culture that we live in. And it's just found a few verses earlier. If you want to open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. Now, before I read this, I just want to say again that, it might get a little confusing right away. We're going to read it all at once, but because I want to read it, and I want you to hear it just like the people Jesus was talking to would have heard it 2,000 years ago. And then we're going to break it down. I would love if we could all stand as we read this parable, as it's part of God's divine word. Okay. Matthew chapter 13, we're going to be in verse 24. We'll read up to verse 30. It says this. He put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field, but while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and went away. So when the plants came up and bore again, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds? He said to them, an enemy has done this. So the servants said to him, then do you want us to go and gather them? But he said, no, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. You can be seated. All right. Also, excuse my I got a lot of sinus stuff going on. I'm sorry about that. And I have a microphone on my face, so it's just like, so I'm sorry in advance. Basically, you have a guy who planted a field of good crops, but someone came and planted a bunch of bad weeds to mess with them, right? But no one knew this until after the good and bad plants started to grow. So the people who were working on the field went to the guy who owned the field, and they said, maybe they should just start pulling out all the weeds. The thing that we might not understand that Jesus' listeners definitely would have understood is that early in the growth cycle, wheat and weeds that can grow with wheat look super alike, like super similar. And if the people working in the field had decided to pull out everything that looked like a weed, they most likely would have pulled out most of the wheat also, okay? And so knowing this, the owner stopped them and said, if you start pulling the weeds out, you might accidentally pull out the good stuff too. So we need to wait until the harvest. That way we can pull out everything and then separate the wheat from the weeds. That way we won't lose any of the good crops. Now, one of the coolest things about Jesus' parables is that they can often be applied to a lot of different topics. And when we apply this specific parable to our culture, I think we might start to see how Jesus actually feels about it. For example, when we apply this parable to culture, I think we see the good seed might represent the things that are completely God-honoring, right? The good seed is the God-honoring things that promote the same values Jesus promoted. For example, these things would be aspects of our culture that encourage us to love, support, encourage, accept, respect each other. But there are also things in our culture that do the exact opposite. These would represent the weeds. These are things that encourage us to be divided, judgmental, even malicious and hurtful towards others. Jesus wasn't saying that those things are okay. In fact, he said that ultimately those things will be separated and destroyed, right? But he also said that we need to be careful that we aren't throwing out everything good just to avoid something really bad. And if I apply this concept to my life, I think Jesus was saying that there are some movies that are bad for me. I think there are some movies that are bad for me. But that doesn't mean that I should necessarily avoid all music or all movies just because I think that there is some music that is bad for me, right? I need to pay attention to how movies and music affect my life and then make informed decisions about what I should and should not allow myself to experience. Now, if you're anything like the people that were listening to Jesus teach, you might be feeling more confused than you were at the beginning. You're like, what are you talking about right now? In some ways, that's really good. Because I think that Jesus taught in parables because he wanted people to get a little confused, which would lead them to think even harder about the meaning of what they had just heard. Here are a few hints to help you figure out how you should respond to the culture that we live in. The first thing is this: don't throw it out just because it might be bad. Don't throw it out just because it might be bad. Look, I understand where my grandparents and my mom's youth pastor were coming from. And it would be a lot easier to just avoid bad movies and bad music if I just avoided all movies and all music, right? Yeah? But like Jesus talks about in the parable, if I do that, I might also miss out on something that's really, really uplifting and good. So does that mean we can just watch and listen to whatever we want? Or we can do whatever we want? No, what it boils down to is we need to be even more aware of what we're allowing to influence us. I'm going to say that again. We need to be even more aware of what we're allowing to influence us. The second thing is this. The first thing is don't throw it out just because it might be bad. The second thing is make informed decisions about what's good and what's not good for you. Thankfully, I've learned a lot since I was a kid. I've learned a lot about my diet. I learned that my diet consisting of 100% ice cream and cookies is bad for me. But if you had asked me when I was like 5 years old, I would have told you that a diet of pure cookies and cream would have just been perfect, would have been awesome. But you guys, especially you seniors, are growing up now. You are going on to that next phase now. You're growing up, and part of the process is learning what's good for you. Learning what's good for you and what's not good for you. And as you keep getting older, you'll start to be able to recognize the difference even earlier in the process. But identifying what's good for you and what's not good for you is only half the question. The third thing is this: when you realize that something is not good for you, cut it out completely. Cut it out completely. In the parable, the owner tells the workers that once the harvest happens, they'll be able to separate the good stuff from the bad stuff. Okay? And the bad stuff will get thrown into the fire. If there's something that's a part of our culture that you know isn't good for you, do not participate. Do not participate. In fact, run the other direction as fast as you can. If you know that listening to music with a lot of cursing tends to lead you to cursing, don't listen to it. It sounds like easy, doesn't it? It sounds like, yeah, duh. I know some of you struggle with it. I know some of you deal with that. If you know watching a movie or a TV show has nudity in it causes you to lust, what should you do? Not watch it. You should stop watching it. You should stop watching shows with nudity. If your favorite social media platform is leading you to become negative and angry and narcissistic or an internet troll or irritable in real life, stop engaging with that social media platform altogether. Altogether. Part of becoming mature is being able to make those decisions for yourself. For yourself, even if it means becoming a little unpopular with the people around you, which leads to the last and honestly probably the most difficult thing for us to do. Probably the most difficult thing for us to do, which is don't judge others if they come to a different conclusion than you do. Don't judge others if they arrive at a different decision. In another parable found in Luke chapter 18, 10 through 14, Jesus said this: 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But even like the tax collector, but the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes up to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified, rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Do you notice the key difference between these two? The key difference, the first guy in the Pharisee made his prayer all about how he was better than the other guy, the tax collector. Was he wrong? No, not really. Not really. The tax collector was among the most reviled people in those days, and so he was not the best as a person, in a way. That's a nice way to put it. And so the Pharisee's being honest, but he only tried to make himself look good by making the tax collector look bad. But the tax collector was also honest. He knew his faults. He understood that he was a sinner. He didn't need to drag anyone else through the mud in order to be honest about himself. He did not need to drag anyone else through the mud in order to be honest about himself. And I think some of us need that today. The point is, be like the tax collector. Be honest about yourself, and don't judge others who hold different ideas than your own. Look, the point of all this is culture is all around us. Culture is all around us. Some of it's good. Some of it's not good. Some of it's not good. Does Jesus hate culture? Nah, I don't think he does. But he does want us to be aware of and respond to its impact on our lives. I'm going to say that one more time. Jesus does want us to be aware of and respond to culture's impact on our lives. Okay. He wants us to learn how to separate culture's wheat from culture's weed without just throwing them both into the fire. Does that make sense? He wants us to take an honest look at these individual aspects of culture and learn how to discern whether we ought to embrace those aspects or reject them altogether based on godly values. And so learning to discern, which is a huge part of this, learning to discern and apply your decisions regarding the culture in your life is a process. It's not just going to happen overnight. You're not going to wake up and be like, I got it. I know it now. I promise I'm still learning things that are bad for me. Every day I learn, I'm like, oh man, I shouldn't keep eating this ice cream. Do I? Sometimes yes, but I've got to get better at it. I'm just being honest, okay? I'm being the tax collector right now. But learning to discern and apply your decisions regarding the culture in your life is a process. It's not going to be overnight. You're going to make mistakes, and when you do, you realize them, you learn from them, you make changes to how you act. And then you get moving again. You don't just stay there. You get moving again. And in doing so, you'll be strengthening your ability to think critically about the culture and how, as a follower of Jesus, you interact with the culture. Because Jesus does want us to be aware of and respond to the impact that culture has on us.